This is Chris Evans from Architecting IT, and I'm here today with Matt Watts, Chief Evangelist at NetApp. How are you doing, Matt?
I'm doing very well, Chris. Good to be able to talk to you today.
So, Matt, let's talk about business alignment. Now, this is quite an interesting topic, I think, because inevitably, when you look at the way that technology is deployed on premises and shipped to customers internally, there's very much a sort of a disconnect between perhaps what the business wants and the way that IT works. And I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. So, inevitably, IT buys hardware, technology, physical boxes, and so on, puts it on the floor, typically purchased through sort of capital purchases, although that model is changing to a certain degree. But the business wants to consume OpEx. The business wants to be able to consume gigabytes of capacity, and they want to be able to reference it in terms of things like performance and latency and so on. The sort of the metrics that relate to the application. Now, in a hybrid model, and when you're using the public cloud, we've got a much more, I think, a bigger opportunity here to align to what the business wants, because we're not having to do that conversion factor. So really, hybrid gives us an opportunity to really deliver some business alignment, I think.
Yeah, and this is something you and I have talked about before, Chris, and I think this is such an important thing. Is that how many years have we been going through chargeback and showback and all these
Yeah.
really complex models? Because what we've been trying to do is make a capital investment, which typically comes from IT, and then somehow try and apportion how that's being consumed and used back out to the business. It's complex. It's moving money around. Whereas I think you're absolutely right. When you think about the cloud, it's built for whoever wants to use it. If you've got a business unit that says I need this amount of compute and storage resources because I've got a project to work on, knock yourself out. And it's then consumed and it's paid for by that particular business unit. So I think it helps to solve a lot of the complexities that we've seen in kind of terms of chargeback and showback, which I'm sure some people have got that right, but in my experience, that's been incredibly complicated.
I think you're right. I mean, I've tried to implement so many different chargeback models and had a lot of pushback from chargeback. Showback tends to be more sort of acceptable to people, but when you talk about chargeback, it can be incredibly difficult to get people to agree that they've used the technology the way they have. You then get into arguments about how you bill. Do you do per day billing, per minute billing? It just becomes so complex, and it means that you have to build in models that take so much additional information from your infrastructure in order to do that. Now, it's much nicer to be able to say, well, if you're going to use a hybrid solution, all of that's going to be done for you. As long as you structure it correctly, you're going to get billing that really meets what the business wants. More appropriately, once you've used that technology, you're now not paying for it anymore. It's not like you've committed to that storage or whatever for a few years, and then when you don't want it, somebody else has got to find a usage for it. You finished using it, you pay, you give it back, and you're not paying anymore. It really, really sort of aligns with the business's financials, and I think performance and capacity is another one. Those metrics that people use when they're looking at what they want when they consume storage. The business doesn't want to know how you've implemented that. They just want to know that they've got an endpoint, they can consume it, and away they go.
Yeah, and I think the one thing that's really important, and again, it's an interesting point of discussion, is people sometimes look at the cloud, and I think we've moved away from the fact that the cloud is cheap, right? I think that people have realized that actually, in most cases, you do end up paying some form of a premium for the cloud, but it's because of exactly these things. It's you can go and consume the resources that you need to consume for a particular project, and maybe you would pay a little bit more per gigabyte or a little bit more per CPU cycle than you would if you'd procured the technology. But you can use what you want for as long as you want, and then when you don't want it anymore, you give it back. So it's much more on demand. So actually, people have to think differently about it. Isn't the cost per gigabyte? It isn't the cost per CPU. It's the cost over time of actually, if I'm aligning what I'm spending to the exact needs at that particular point in time, that typically is going to be substantially lower than making big capital investments into on-premises purchases where you're trying to cater for the peaks, and those don't occur that frequently.
Yeah, I think a good analogy there is the use of cars, transport. So, I could buy a car, I could drive everywhere personally. The cost of that car would come out as, as a certain amount every year, and I'd have to service it. I have to pay all those costs personally. Or I could go to a lease company when I only need a car for a week, pay for the lease cost. I'm pushing a lot of the charges in terms of management and everything to that company, but I'll pay a little bit more than I'd pay than I would if I bought that car outright. And then, of course, there's the super granular implementation where I use something like Uber or Lyft or a taxi company. I literally pay for the journey I want. When I've finished that journey, I get out and I'm done. And I think what you've just described there is we're trying to transition towards that model where we've now got such a degree of flexibility, we only use the technology when we want. And ultimately, that's what businesses are going to want to do. So it's more about a term we've used before, time to value, and actually delivering the value more than you are delivering the physical technology.
Yeah, absolutely agreed, Chris. And again, bringing this back to kind of what is NetApp's role within all of this, I think maybe stretching your analogy a little bit too far, but if you're used to driving a BMW, then actually wouldn't you like to have a BMW when you use Uber? I mean, that's maybe a little bit too much of a stretch, but I think knowing that whatever you've been doing with the capital expenditures that you've making, the on-premises technology, actually you can have that in the cloud that looks and feels and behaves exactly the same way, but comes with all of those benefits that you've just described in terms of use it when you need it and release it when you don't.
Yeah, the business is getting a lot of other value as well. I mean, you're taking the human out of the provisioning process, for example. As you said, infinite capacity, so there's no need to be so far forward on planning. They need to do their internal cost planning, but they don't need to come to you with projections and things like that because it's just going to be there. So I think if you can align to the business, that's a powerful thing to do, and the hybrid cloud definitely lets you do that.
Yeah, agreed. And each business, as they look at the kind of the next innovation, knows exactly what the cost of the resources are going to be required that will enable them to achieve that innovation. So again, it's so much more aligned with this sort of much more dynamic business model that we're seeing.
Exactly.